All right, give everybody just a couple more minutes and then we'll go ahead and jump in. All right, so good morning and welcome. So my name is Brian Crooks. I'm the Interim Planning Services Manager with Richland County. We are here today to talk about the Land Development Code rewrite. And with me is Mr. Tommy DeLage, the Assistant Zoning Administrator. And so this is just one of many public forums that we're having on the public hearing draft of the Land Development Code. And so what we're doing today is pretty much the same conversation that we're going to be having in all of the other forums, with maybe some slight variation related to comments and questions that we receive. And so, but otherwise, the presentation as a whole and the information that's provided is generally just the same exact thing. And so just kind of some background on the Land Development Code rewrite. This is the process that's been going on for about 3 or 4 years now. And we've had various work products that have been presented throughout this rewrite, looking at a variety of different things. And so back in March of 2020, prior to the pandemic hitting, we had released the consolidated draft, had some in-person meetings planned, but had to then shift those to a digital format, and had some meetings throughout that time up to December, submitting comments. And so what we have now is the public hearing draft, which is really kind of the culmination of this rewrite process for what we're looking to accomplish with this. And so looking at kind of an overview of what we're looking at today, really looking at some of these primary objectives with what we're looking to accomplish with the code rewrite. Moving from there, looking at what we're calling big differences between the old code and this new proposed code that the rewrite's looking to establish. Similarly, we're going to be looking at some of these other articles that have some minor differences that are kind of important enough to really kind of hit and highlight, but are not things that are necessarily going to be super different in a lot of cases. And then we're going to be finishing the conversation, opening up for comments and questions. And so the way that we're going to be doing that is through utilization of the chat bar function. So as you have comments, as you have questions throughout this presentation, go ahead and submit them to the chat bar. So that way, if it's something that we're talking about now and it's something that you're interested in or you have questions on, go ahead and ask that question. But we're going to be circling back to all of the comments and questions at the end of the presentation. So, the purpose of the rewrite and what we're looking to accomplish with it is really trying to meet a new vision for growth and development as part of the 2015 comprehensive plan. So the current Land Development Code last received an update in 2005 with some minor revisions since then. So looking at kind of minor changes to certain sections, certain elements as needed. But for the most part, we're still working under a code that was adopted about 15, 16 years ago. And so the current code is outdated, does not allow for development that meshes with the county's vision for the future, whether that's rural protections, development of suburban centers, or being easy to access and understand. So as As a key measure to implement the county's land use policies, the rewrite sets forth regulations that are in line with current best practices and looks at tackling a variety of objectives in order to meet that policy guidance that the comprehensive plan has. And so the public hearing draft is available for review through a variety of sources. So whether that is through the project website at weplantogether.org or on the Richland County Community Planning and Development Department's webpage at the county's website, or through the office here at the County Administration Building. And so we are open by appointment and certain walk-ins. And so as you know, if you're needing to access that plan, you can't access it digitally. That's one way that you could take a review that plan. Likewise, we have provided copies to the various library branches. And so if that is more convenient to you, you would be able to access the code at those locations in order to review and take a look at. So this, like as I mentioned earlier, this is just one of many engagement opportunities for feedback and information on the code rewrite. So we're looking at having 4 public forums overall. So this one today, and then we had one yesterday, and we're having another one this afternoon and one Thursday evening. And so we're trying to provide as much opportunity as we can for people to review, see, and engage with the code and staff within the confines and constraints of the ongoing pandemic. So we know things have been opening up, but we are still relatively constrained with how we can go about conducting in-person meetings. But as another option is we do have the availability of one-on-one meetings through here at the County Administration Building. So you can sign up by reaching out to staff directly or through the county's homepage using the appointment scheduler. So you are able to meet with staff in person to ask any questions or get clarifications on the code. So our contact information is going to be presented at the end. So you will be able to make sure that you have that as well. So, what are we looking to accomplish with the land development code rewrite? So really looking at 5 primary objectives, one of which is having a user-friendly code. So what the code rewrite looks to do is consolidate and reorganize the land development code structure. So we've included a graphically rich text. So looking at things like illustrations, diagrams, flowcharts, and tables, using down-to-earth language, standardizing procedures for applications and submittals where it's easier to understand, easier to navigate and access, not just for those of us who may be using the code in a day in, day out basis, but also someone that may be picking it up for the first time, or someone who's only looking at it maybe every 3 or 4 years as they're doing projects at their house or doing something with their business. So a key objective for the code rewrite is to implement the policies of Plan Richland County. And so what we're trying to do with this is provide a greater range and type of housing choice than has historically been possible, and ease the ability with which persons can undertake infill, redevelopment, and reinvestment, enable preservation and continuance of rural character and working lands through appropriate zoning, having more open space, better conservation of land, and incentives for green development, and then allowing for military operations to continue and avoiding encroachments, and how the installations in the surrounding areas, ensuring they're being good neighbors to one another through a variety of ways. Really looking at bringing a lot of the standards and regulations within the code up to current best practices. So looking at new districts, new uses, and new use standards that allow for development in different contexts and character versus a one-size-fits-all approach that the current code really allows for. And then we also have, so trying to do that through some of these contemporary development standards that we're looking to accomplish through the code. looking at things like modernized parking standards, a minimum amount of open space requirements across districts for a variety of land uses, having design-informed standards, and really having a code that would help provide for quality development that all residents can agree upon. And then ultimately, looking at implementing some green development practices to have more sustainable development, leading to a more sustainable Richland County as a whole. And so here we're going to be looking at some of these major differences within the land development code that is currently being proposed. And so one way that we as staff have been trying to reference the code rewrite is that this isn't just a update or we're making revisions to the current code. We are looking at adopting an entirely new code as a whole, so that there's enough difference between the old and the new where this really is something that is new in its entirety. So not just being updates or making some adjustments or the things of that nature, but looking at the code as something new in a whole altogether. And so even where there are things in the current code that are kind of carry forward into the new, there's still enough difference where even those looking at it from one picture to the other, it's going to be still different. So Article 2 is the administration article, and this is an article that sees some major changes. And really here, what we've tried to do is make this article more approachable, easier to understand, and more graphic heavy. And so a major change is here provides for a standard set of review procedures across all application types. Where exceptions are or where additional processes are required, we kind of specify what some of those things look like. So really here, looking at what that general process is, so any development type or application type, you're generally going to know here's what that process or procedure looks like. But for specific applications, we kind of spell out what some of those additional steps may include or what those things specifically look like. But establishing that standard procedure for all applications and then noting what some deviations for those specific application types might include. Something else here is, again, much more user-friendly and easier to understand for the process versus the current code. And then likewise, a major departure includes the overall look, feel, and approachability of the code itself. So looking here on the bottom of the screen, we've got a variety of tables, we've got a variety of flowcharts that help demonstrate what some of those steps are or how some of these things work out or what some of these things might entail. So trying to know who is the decision maker or the reviewer or who makes a recommendation on certain application types, that's easily spelled out in charts and things are noted in flow charts as well. So really looking to having a better understanding for everyday citizens, but also for those who are using the code on a daily basis. So it really shows who and how things will be processed and what to expect overall in a much easier way to understand as a whole. So Article 3, or zoning districts, this is one of the three main articles that are within the land development code. So the other two big articles are going to be Article 4, the use regulations, and Article 5, the general development standards. So those are kind of the big three articles that are found within the land development code. So Article 3 specifically relates to our zoning districts, and it sets forth the regulations related to zoning specifically. So really looking at, what those rules are for the zoning districts, looking at dimensional standards, things of that nature. And so what we have within our new code is we have kind of three different categories of zoning districts. So we have our base zoning district, which has a variety of kind of subtypes, this is kind of your standard zoning district. These are things like residential, commercial, industrial, things of that nature. And then planned development districts are something that really allow for greater flexibility, greater design and innovation related to some of those standards. So it's where you're really going above and beyond what can be achieved within that base zoning district. So really being very creative in what those regulations might look like and how that development ends up occurring. And then our third type is an overlay district, which one way to think about it is kind of like a blanket going on top of a base or planned development district, which either adds restrictions to or takes restrictions away from those underlying zoning districts. So really looking to either kind of incentivize something or further restrict or add additional standards to it. So really it's kind of looking at things in addition to the base or the planned development district. And so one thing here with the new code is the overall layout of the zoning district itself. So this is one of the biggest changes that we see with the zoning districts is how they're set up. So the layout now provides examples, it provides diagrams, and it specifically shows how some of these standards would apply on sites. And so the key item here is really related to user friendliness for how everyone can really see and visualize what some of these standards look like and what kind of development is associated with that zoning district. So, looking at some of these concept images of really kind of what some of those things look like within that zoning district, and then having the density and dimensional standards be in a tabular format where they're easy to see and easy to view, but then also how are those represented on a site itself? So we've got the graphic example over here that's really showing what those standards are and how they really play out on a site. And then similarly, we have the references to what these other standards are and where you can find them. And so, taking a look at what some of these, what this look like, what this layout looks like now to what the current zoning district layout is within our code we work under now. And so where all it is basically text and nothing more. And so just reading through this and having to figure out, okay, what is some of this? What does some of this look like? What some of this may entail? And then what are some of these additional standards? There's just a couple of references, but you're really kind of having to flip back and forth on a lot of these things versus having it all consolidated and easy to reference. So, what we have now, what we're going to, and how it's a major difference in overall user friendliness, approachability, and ease of which to understand what that information entails. And so as part of the zoning districts, we've also made several changes that are really looking at refinements, consolidations, and deletions related to some of these zoning districts that were in our previous code going forward into our new code. And so one of the big changes here is a density-based zoning. And so what this does is it removes a minimum lot size standard, but retains some of the other standards such as setbacks. So really this is allowed to greater flexibility and greater design capability for how developments look and how developments function. So really you're getting a more true density and versus having these minimum lot sizes that really kind of constrain how some of these are set up. So really the intent is to really allow for that greater flexibility for lot design and how everything is set up and situated. So one of the other refinements that we made was really having greater variability across districts. And so here really looking at allowing or having development that is more context and character specific. So you get more appropriate size of uses and densities across the various zoning districts versus kind of suburban and suburban, where you've kind of got, one thing and you got this other thing. They're different, but they're still really similar and you're pretty much getting the same kind of thing as part of each. So having greater variability where it's more of a continuum across a spectrum versus just kind of, yeah, we've got this and then we've got this that's kind of the same thing, but it's just slightly different. And so another thing that the code rewrite does is looks at consolidating multiple districts into one. So where we had previous districts that really functioned in the same way, they had very similar standards, they had very similar uses that were allowed within them, rather than having those kind of compete against one another, go ahead and combining them into a much better district overall as a whole in terms of how it works, how it functions. And so some of those were the PR and TROS, which were combined into just the OS open space district. Similarly, the current RSLD and RSMD within our code was really kind of merged together and is really now taken on life as the residential 3 zoning district. And then similarly with our conservation and environmental protection overlay, those are combined as the water resources overlay within the new code. And so one of the other things that we have done is deletion of multiple districts. And so again, here, similar to the consolidation, deleting these districts because they're not really working the way that they need to. So for instance, this is going to be a big one, is the deletion of the rural district. And so one of the issues with the rural district is really it's kind of it's a misnomer. You know, it says it's rural, but it doesn't really allow for a rural character type of development. You know, the way that development can be achieved there, yeah, you can have a 500-acre pig farm, but on the opposite end of what's achievable with it, you could have a kind of cookie cutter suburban style residential subdivision in the same district. And so the way that the rural district is intended and the way it has been functioning is not really the most appropriate for rural areas and rural characters. And so what we are doing with a lot of these districts instead is having new districts that replace these. And so, for instance, the rural district would be replaced by the AG, the homestead, the residential transition districts as more appropriate zoning districts for those specific character areas. So we're not getting rid of rural areas, we're just having zoning districts that are more appropriate to those place types. And so similarly with the manufactured home district, you know, that's a big one that allows for manufactured housing, mobile home parks, things of that nature. Deleting that district because it's really kind of just that and that's it. You know, allowing those uses in more districts, but having additional standards on them so they're not as obtrusive within other zoning districts. And then similarly with some of these other districts, just not functioning the way that we need to have them or the way that they're intended, and can really be served better as new districts in the new code instead. So ultimately, we're looking at 20 districts overall across the base, plan development, and overlay districts within the new code, which is similar to the amount that we have within our current zoning code. And so we're not really necessarily losing or gaining too many more than what we currently have. And so here we wanted to take a look at of what we're calling zoning equivalencies or a translation. And so really what this looks at is what the kind of character and context of what the new zoning district is and how it kind of equates to the current code in terms of what that district was really kind of looking to achieve. So for instance here, the agricultural district, the most equivalent in terms of context and character from the current code is going to be the rural district. And that's kind of, you'll notice that for a lot of these districts is that in terms of context and character of what you could be achieving with the RU, well, that context and character that may have been able to happen is kind of equivalent within a lot of these new districts, but it's more specific to one type versus a kind of broad variety of types that would have been able to occur. Similarly, some of these residential districts, looking at things that are very much similar from the old code to the new code, but still are going to have significant differences between the two. So for instance, looking at R2, R3, R4, R5, R6, all of these things are relatively similar to current zoning districts, but are still going to be different enough that they're not truly the same. So that's why we're looking at these as being equivalent or a translation, where it's not always going to mean or be the same exact thing, but it's the closest thing to it. And so in some cases, there are some things that are pretty much going to be nearly identical, but they're still going to be slightly different. So basically think of it as an identical twin where it's a different person, but they kind of look and feel the same. So thinking about LI, HI, GC, again, really kind of identical to what we have now, but still based on some of the new general development standards, things like that, they will work and function slightly different than what has historically been occurring with our current code. And then again, some of these, for instance, the mixed use 2, mixed use 3, and some of the new planned development districts, there's not really an equivalent between our old code and the new code, is because what these are obviously new, but they're going to allow for types of development that are not currently able to be achieved within the zoning code now. And so really looking at a significant departure in terms of how some of these things look and how some of these things allow for developments at levels that are really not able to exist currently. And then again, looking at some of these overlay districts, a lot of these things really kind of stay the same. They're just kind of renamed, have some minor refinements to it. But some of these, again, so like the military installation overlay, nothing that's really truly equivalent to it. And then the neighborhood character overlay, we have some within the current code, but these are really kind of not still as true to what the neighborhood character going forward would be looking to achieve. And so here, wanted to look at some more of what these equivalencies look like, but specifically looking at those densities. And so, some of these, so on the new districts on the left, the current or old district on the right. So a lot of these densities are very similar or slightly different, and then some of these are significantly changed. And so again, thinking about the AG, HMRT that are intended for more specific rural character areas, we get more appropriate densities related to such. Instead of having this density that the current RU would allow for, well, that's really more similar or equivalent to the R1 as it exists within the new code. And so really, again, going back to that context, character, and variability across the zoning districts where we have appropriate zoning for appropriate place types and the type of development and character that we want to see in those areas. And so looking at what some of these new zoning districts look like, so the AG district is one of the two that's intended to provide a true rural character. And so the AG and the homestead really looking at working lands uses and large tracts of acreage for residences. And so really these two districts are served as one of many potential replacements for the current RU. So where we're trying to have that rural character, that rural context, we have zoning districts that are more appropriate for such than the current RU is. And so the AG really provides for increased opportunities for agriculture, very, very low intensity residential, and some environmentally or eco-driven commercial and industrial uses that are really kind of related to some of those agricultural facets. And then, so really looking at a density standard of 0.15 that equates to about a 7-acre minimum for that district. And then also would have a zoning district minimum. So the AG district as a whole would have to have 35 contiguous areas made up of AG or homestead. So you have to have some of this contiguous area of these like zoning districts in order for that to really occur. And so the HM, as being this other true rural character district, provides for very low intensity residential uses, as well as small scale agricultural uses and some others. And so really kind of looking at the agricultural district being more so catered towards working farms, larger scale agricultural uses, and then the homestead being more specific to residences, or a way to think about it is more so that rural residential type of character. And then some other new districts that we have are the mixed use districts, the corridor mixed use, and the community mixed use, so the MU2 and MU3. And really these are intended to help support commercial development along corridors and at activity centers that really focus upon walkability, integration, and mixture of uses at relatively intense scales. That'll be a significant departure from the historic development pattern that's really able to be achieved in the current code. So really kind of focusing on nodes, centers, and some corridors where we want to have more built up areas, and we want to have greater intensity of uses. And so really that's what those mixed use districts would allow for. Two other new districts include the EMP Employment District and the INS Institutional District. So what the EMP is it's intended to help facilitate employment type uses such as industrial development related to processing, manufacturing, while still being complementary to medium and high intensity residential uses and some commercial uses that you really want to have around or with employment facilities. So that way, as people are working, they're on their lunch break, they're leaving, whatnot, they'll be able to kind of go do some of their kind of basic needs that they would need to do versus having to do everything in multiple locations. So really trying to make sure that you have uses that are complementary to each other and really help facilitate some of that economic development that the county's interested in. The INS district is really intended for larger campuses for educational and other facilities. So think government facilities, libraries, schools, things of that nature. And so really this helps provide a variety of relevant uses all in one district versus having to have a hodgepodge of multiple districts that you would currently. And so one thing with it would be ensuring compatibility with the surrounding area while still ensuring compatibility within that development or site itself. So having this larger area of institutional zoning instead of having multiple districts that may not necessarily be as compatible, but would still be achieving that same thing. So really looking at, having that greater compatibility within those sites. And so two other of these new zoning districts include the Employment Campus Plan Development District and the Traditional Neighborhood Design Plan Development District. And so what the PDEC really does is looks at some of those larger master planned employment parks. So think industrial parks, things of that nature, where really it's intended to help facilitate broader site development as a whole related to industrial development, but having more integrated sites versus scattered locations. And so really kind of thinking about having an integration of all the necessary uses that might need to go along with these employment campuses. And so one way to think about this is kind of establishing that company town type of development where you've got all of your industrial or commercial uses related to your employment, but then you still got some of that service commercial, you still got a variety of housing types to help house workers and those involved with the ongoing everyday business related to those employment facilities. And then the traditional neighborhood design really looks at having human-scaled, walkable neighborhoods where you're really providing for those complete neighborhoods where you can meet all of your daily needs all within that one location. So really having that kind of town center feel, mixture of uses, open space throughout. So kind of that town green, if you will, mixture of housing types, smaller streets, and a variety of commercial uses where, if you need to stop by the pharmacy, you need to stop by the shop for lunch, you'd be able to do a variety of those things all within your single neighborhood versus having to drive a couple of miles down the road or the like. And then our overlay districts, so we're really looking at two new overlay districts here. So the neighborhood character overlay and the military installation overlay. And both of these really are looking to specifically implement land use policies and recommendations from the comprehensive plan and the various neighborhood plans that are a part of it. And so the neighborhood character overlay corresponds directly to those adopted neighborhood master plans that we have throughout the county, and is really looking to provide the ability for protections and preservation of certain characteristics of neighborhoods. And so there would be limited applicability based on the master plans itself, but also some standards in terms of the district of what could be done and how that really functions. And so one example that staff has been really looking at with this is in regards to the Olympia Mill Village. So the Olympia area, that is a National Register Historic District. So we have these historic homes, we have these historic structures. And so as new development or redevelopment occurs, that we have these historic protections for how some of that new development looks. So the development that's going up is not out of character, is not out of context with what is currently existing within that area. And so the other new overlay is the military installation overlay. And really what this looks at is military compatibility and protections for the various bases and installations in the county. So Fort Jackson, McGrady Trading Center, and then McIntyre Air National Guard Base. And so what this really looks at is how do we provide protections and standards for the areas around it to ensure the viability and operations of those facilities. So really looking at things like avoiding and mitigating aircraft obstruction, noise impacts, and land use incompatibilities. And so really it's an outcome to ensure that the impacts from the bases are not wholly experienced to those neighboring residents, but also impacts from those neighboring residents are not affecting the operation and viability of those installations. So really just looking at a variety of those protections and how those look, work, and function. And so with this, I'm going to hand it over to Mr. DeLage to talk about Article 5, the General Development Standards. And again, this is kind of one of those main articles from the Land Development Code. And so there's a good amount of information here that we're really wanting to highlight with how we're looking at changing a lot of elements and what some of these major differences are for improving the Land Development Code. Tommy?
All right, thank you, Mr. Cook. So with these general development standards, it basically takes all of the different standards that were scattered throughout the current code and consolidates them into 14 sections. One way to kind of look at the listing that we have up here is what you see in red were major changes, major revisions. And then what you see in the light blue were some modifications and revisions going through. And then as in the darker blue, just minor changes, just as would be there, maybe just, changed a little bit of language, but but not substantive. So it basically is carried over from the previous code or the most current one. Next slide, please. So one of the big changes is the access, mobility, and connectivity requirements. So we're looking at having more access and connections to external streets. One of those being for not only for safety reasons, but also for traffic. Also restrictions on cul-de-sacs. And really what that means is now that you're having to provide for additional streets, links, which we'll get into with the connectivity index, but it also shortens cul-de-sacs. So what you're currently allowed of 800 feet down to 500 feet. And the idea is so that you don't have, one long cul-de-sac in a subdivision with just a bunch of cul-de-sacs off of it. Now with the connectivity index, as you'll see in the figure that's up in the right corner of the screen, there's now a calculation that is used to see if you meet the requirements for having nodes and links. And the idea behind that is to shorten so you don't have these kind of super blocks of just big long stretches of houses without any kind of roads or links to adjacent. We also have a new requirements for as far as for access between adjacent developments. Again, trying to help with that traffic so you're not having to get onto a major road to basically go to the next parcel that's adjacent to a development. Also having bond requirements. So if that adjacent development's not happening right away, there are certain requirements that take place that will ensure that there's a future connection and that that the money's there to help develop that. And then also with pedestrian connections. So making sure that if you have external sidewalks or existing sidewalks, that when these new developments come in, that there's actually connectivity to those. And the figures in the right corner is the as Brian's hovering over. Next, please. So another big change is the off-street parking and loading standards. So currently our code is 15 years old, and of course not including the time that it took to actually write it prior to its adoption. So more additional research has been done. New uses have come along that weren't envisioned back then. So basically we're updating that to modern standards. Also looking into more use of pervious materials. I think the pervious pavers and things like that were just coming around in the early 2000s. Again, there's a lot more materials and possibilities and options for people to use for that now. Also look at basically if you wanted to add impervious surface now and exceed either the mid or max ranges of the parking code, there's certain mitigation efforts that would have to take place. Now in the new code, we've allowed for that, so if you exceed the max range, but we've also simplified it so it's not as hard to figure out what would need to be required to be done to kind of mitigate that. We've also eliminated some minimum parking in certain districts where it made sense, because folks aren't just not going to have any off-street parking, but not necessarily having a minimum requirement for certain uses that would only need a few spaces. But also we've established some new maximum parking standards, idea again to make sure that we don't have these seas of parking lots. We've also allowed for a new mixed use calculation, whereas before mixed use centers just got a one size fit all parking calculation for your mid max range. Now it looks specifically at those individual uses. So, if you have your barber shop that's open during the day, and then you've got your bar that opens up at night, but then you've got your office building, and, that way you're not over parking a site. There's also new standards for large parking lots. And what that is looking at the aisle lists and how they're laid out. And again, the idea behind that is not to have just a sea of parking. Also looking at stacking standards. So thinking of when you're going to the drive-through for a bank or the drive-through for a restaurant, we've kind of updated those and modernized those. And again, the idea behind that is so you don't have cars that are stacked up going throughout the parking lot and then spilling out to the public road or right of way. We've also updated our biking standards. So added more information, given some visual details about that as how that can be laid out for the different uses and different zoning districts. And then we've also looked at our transportation demand management provision, which basically allows for a applicant or a developer or business owner to potentially even reduce their required parking through things of demonstrating that they have access to things like ride share or Uber, or maybe even that they have certain number of employees who are working offsite, commuting, working remote. Maybe they're on a bus route, so again it allows them to reduce their required parking. Next slide, please. So with the landscaping, there's some additional information regarding maintenance and species diversity. So, and really what that's about is providing for more landscaping diversity on site. So that way, if there's a disease or, you're not just having something that's the same plant everywhere throughout the buffer. So it gives a little bit of variety. We've also looked at the transitional buffer yard standards and trying to make those a little bit more easier to comprehend. So as of right now, you have certain uses which equate to a type A, B, C, or D buffer. And then what you have to do is you kind of have to match them up with the chart. Well, this makes it just a little bit simpler based on the use. There's also refinements to the street protective yards and also the parking lot standards. And again, the idea is to basically screen those parking lots a little bit better than what our current code does, but also to allow again for your green medians and some space in there, so it's not just all again it's a sea of parking or asphalt. Also looking at the landscape requirements. So if you look in the figure down in the right corner, it's showing the plantings along the base of a building, and again that's just to provide again for some more screening from adjacent properties or right of ways. And then we've also strengthened the tree protection standards. So looking at, as of like right now, if you've got a grand tree and it's in a required buffer yard, but for some reason it has to be removed, you've got a mitigation of 6-1. Well, now we're looking at other species other than just what would be considered grand trees based on that diameter at breast height, and as far as mitigation efforts for that. And again, in an effort to provide for incentives or provide more reason to keep natural native trees that are actually on the site there, or either providing for additional mitigation efforts if they have to be removed. Next slide, please. So another big one is the open space set-asides. Most of our development that has come in has taken advantage of our current open space code, which uses these open space set-asides. So in exchange for reducing minimum lot sizes, there's now mandatory minimum open space requirements for all development. And again, those are intended to, again, leave as much undeveloped land as possible for a project versus grading everything over and then basically paving it. Also, the standards related to the design, the configuration of how those open spaces are, and then what is prioritized has been strengthened and added in there. So basically, the typical stuff, think of your floodplain, your wetlands, retention or detention pond that is designed to be as an amenity, think a walking trail or a gazebo on there. We've kind of prioritized what's important, what you need to include in there. Also provided information about maintenance ownership, so that way it's clear and upfront when it's turned over after everything's been built, who's responsible for maintaining those, whether it be a property owners association or HOA or the actual owner of the property. And then some of the standards for those natural features are kind of carried forward. So if you'll see the table on the open space set aside below, that's again talking about your natural features, your required landscaping stuff, so street protective yard, your transition yards, think of your water quality buffers, so along any kind of river, streams, wetlands, ponds, lakes. Next slide, please. Another big change, cluster development. So this was in an effort to allow for in the more rural districts of the new code. So thinking of your AG and your homestead districts to allow for context and character appropriate development. So the idea is rather than taking a 100-acre tract of land and then having to go through and provide a roadway to all these larger lots, what you would do is you provide a buffer or a screening of natural vegetation, or it could be a berm. There's a lot of different varieties on how you can achieve this between the road right of way to where the development takes place. That also shortens the infrastructure. It shortens the amount of land that's disturbed for the subdivision, but also makes it to where if you're riding down a rural highway, you don't look and see a development that's back right up to the roadway. Ideally, it would be screened using those buffer requirements. Next slide, please. We also have changes with our design and form standards. So the idea behind this is that it would help when redevelopment or new development comes in certain districts. So think of your MU1, MU2, MU3 districts. So those are intended to be in areas where you'd be on like a major road corridor. I'll use Decker Boulevard as a good example. So if you're familiar with Decker Boulevard, there's a lot of commercial that goes down Decker, but on either side of Decker, off those major roads are typically residential. So in that case, if it were to be an MU district, there are certain standards that have to take place as far as how facades are done, how the buildings are spaced. Also, you kind of your roofs and the angles, so you don't have an extreme between a 3-story residence and then 1-story residence, and then and transparency as well. Next slide, please. And that's a good kickoff for our neighborhood compatibility and agricultural compatibility standards. So again, the idea is to protect the character of existing neighborhoods. This kind of gets into more of a form-based code or requirements. So if you look at the graphic down below, the idea is as you get to the more residential that's already established, you don't have such a hard transition. So you don't have a retail storefront and then it looks completely different than the residents below. So the idea in that graphic is there's a gradation. You see the single family residence, and then as you move towards that commercial, you see a 2-family residence, maybe an office building, and then your traditional commercial kind of development. With the agricultural compatibility, again, this is big for, not saying that if you want to develop, that it's not necessarily a bad thing to be next to a farm, but you want to provide a buffer to allow for that working farm to continue its viability. The idea behind those buffers are to reduce impacts from noise, dust, odor, and then also for the subdivision, you kind of have a transition. So it's going to be seen in the graphic. Most of you've got your buffer yard along your right of way, then you've got your little bit smaller lots that are clustered around, and then as you get closer to that buffer, they become larger lots. So again, more character appropriate. Next slide, please. And then there's the new green development incentives. Again, the intent is to provide for resource efficient technologies and kind of give a carrot for doing that. Examples are like mini split heating units and cooling units rather than your traditional large HVAC, using gray water for irrigation and other features as well. And then the idea behind that is for using those incentives, you can get an increase in building height or density, maybe even a reduction in your lot area, or that's your required lot area, decrease in parking requirements, and also your setbacks as well. And the idea behind this is it's an a la carte kind of approach. You can kind of pick and choose which ones you want to use. And then there's a schedule. You have to get so many out of the A category or the B category. And then that gives you one incentive. You can't double dip. So if you want to get a decrease in the required lot area and an increase in residential density, you've got to meet the requirements for both of those in the chart to be able to achieve it. So again, they're stackable, or they can just be used one time for one particular incentive. Next slide, please. So getting into the articles with minor changes, and I'll be switching this off to Mr. Crooks here shortly, but looking at our use regulations, so we've kind of gone through and reorganized those. We've added some new uses and removed some old uses. Videotape, disc, and rental stores is the example I use. As the market's changed over the years, there's not too many of those left. So we've kind of refined it and provided a kind of hierarchy of how they're listed. So kind of your classification, your category, your type. So then like you have your agricultural, and then as part of that category, you've got, your community garden or your poultry farm. We've also revised some of those uses and permissions, basically for special requirements and special exceptions. Most are carried forward to a small degree as far as they are now. But we've also eliminated the reference to the NAICS, which is a identifier it's an industry classification system for different uses, but they update it and change it so often it would require updates to the code, periodically as they adopted new ones. So instead, what we did is we've actually taken our uses and then we've defined them in our code. So if there's a use that is in our table, you can go into our code and find that definition and see if you fit in with that exact use. We've also, throughout this process, identified a number of uses that either we hadn't thought of or have come about during the code rewrite. So as part of our recommendations with the adoption of the code, will be also to add some of that. And then as well, there may be some additional changes as we receive public input. But with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Crooks.
All right, thanks, Tommy. So looking at some more of these articles with some minor changes. There we go. So Article 6 is our land development subdivision standards. And so two big changes here is going to be a reference to the land development manual, which is a separate document that really talks about the ongoing development of a site. So how does that look? How does the ongoing development, so things related to stormwater, things related to site grading, things of that nature, more so on the engineering side of the site development, that's what a lot of that would entail as part of the land development manual. So it references the need to comply with it as part of the ongoing development of a site. And then additionally for Article 6, we look at the required block sizes where we reduce the minimum and maximums for blocks. So that overall length that a block is, you're not having such long, large blocks. You're having much shorter, much manageable, walkable block areas instead. And then Article 7 is our nonconformities article. And one big change here is centralizing and consolidating all the references to nonconformities into this one single article. So currently, a lot of that language is in the nonconformity sections itself, but there are instances where some language related to nonconformities is in another section entirely. So for instance, things like the sign nonconformities, those are in the sign section versus being in the nonconformity section. So making some changes related to it. And then another change is really adding some flexibility for how parking and landscaping needs to be brought into conformity with a change of use or a redevelopment of a property. So, where you're going from one business to another business, how does that look? How do you have some flexibility where, because that site was this thing and now it's going to that thing, but because you're moving to that, well, now you've got to add 800 parking spaces kind of thing. Well, so how do we look at having some flexibility, having some of that related to things like parking, things like landscaping, where it might be overburdensome to that property owner in order for them to bring their site into conformity. So allowing some of that flexibility for some of those particular items. And then Article 9 is really our definitions, rules of construction, and rules of measurement. So a lot of the things that are really important to the code, but it's more so just how we're looking at a variety of developments. So, what are things like setbacks? What are the different lot types? How do you measure a block length? And so one of the changes here is in the current code, it's really all verbal text. So it's just, that's it. That's all you got. There's no real kind of indicator of how you would be looking at it other than what it says. And so what we've done with the new code is really, again, going back to that user friendliness, adding a lot of graphics related to some of those things. So, looking at here, I'm like, well, how do we actually measure a block length? Well, it's from, one center line to the other center line, as it kind of bisects that area. Similarly, well, what's a corner lot? What's an interior lot? Well, we have a description of what those are, but also, well, hey, here's what some of those things look like. So, a corner lot is going to be something that is on the corner, through lot's a through lot, etc. And then really another thing here is looking at having definitions for a lot of items, specifically the land uses themselves. So all of the land uses, as Tommy mentioned, are now going to be defined specifically within the land development code, but also a lot of the other terms that are mentioned throughout, a lot of those things are going to be referenced in those definitions. So things like grand trees, so what exactly does that entail? That's defined within this article itself. And then another thing here is a specific reference to the delegation of authority to professional level staff. So, going back to Article 2, that administration article, where we have the table of summary of responsibilities and duties, well, all of those are kind of that top level position that has that overall authority. Well, they can, delegate some of those responsibilities to appropriate professional level staff. So, where the zoning administrator has the decision for sign permits, well, that could also just be the zoning analyst in terms of that review and that approval, instead of it being the zoning administrator position directly. And so that's one of those things that's noted here specifically, is that delegation of authority to appropriate staff. And so that's really kind of the topics that we wanted to discuss as part of the presentation. And so, as I mentioned earlier, want to make sure we had time for questions and comments. And so I know we've been getting some through the chat box already. So continue to provide those as you have them. And then if you have any additional questions or comments, after this, or something that you thought of later, you can email Mr. DeLage or myself at our emails here. And then similarly, wanting more information about some of this material, you can access the code document on the department's webpage, but also on the project website as well. So, and then again, you can come into the county building or visit your library to see a hard copy of that code. And so with that, we'll dive into some of these questions and comments that we've been getting so far. All right, so an Article 3 question: has the new recommendations done away with RU zoning? If this is true, is rural land now classified under agricultural? So the first part of that question, yes, we are deleting the RU zoning. So the RU zoning is going away, but not everything is going to be remapped, if you will, the same. So what was this rural district could become one of many different things. So in particular to that, it could be the agricultural district, it could be the homestead district, it could be the residential transition district, or it could be something else entirely. So for instance, in areas that are agricultural lands, they're, significant amount of acreage, so it's a working farm, there's a probably good chance that that's going to become the agricultural district. If it's a single residence on a large tract of land, that's probably going to be more specific to the homestead district. If it's a residence or an institutional use on a smaller tract of land, but it's still it's not suburban, it's more bordering on the rural character type, probably going to be RT. And so it's going to be a variety of those things, because we also have areas in the county that are truly urban areas. So for instance, some areas off of Monticello Road and places like that are zoned RU, but that's not an appropriate district for that area. And so those are some of the things that we're looking at. So it's not always going to be a direct one-to-one. So going back to that translation table, or equivalency table rather, how some of those things may look, thinking about the RU district, it's going to be one to many in a lot of cases. There's a potential for a lot of those things to be something other than, AG, homestead, what have you. But the main ones that we're looking at in terms of what that RU was looking to achieve in a lot of cases, that rural character in specific, would be more so appropriate to the AG, to the homestead, to the rural transition district. So those are kind of the three main candidates that we really see replacing the RU. So AG question, I see you have AG listed under special purpose. Why would it be listed as special purpose? And does that require special exceptions for future development? So it's just that base zoning district type. And so let me pull up how that's actually defined. Give me just a second. And so really these are just kind of looking at districts that are looking to do something very specific. So that's why it's the open space, it's the AG, it's the homestead, because these are really trying to create that specific character type. So the OS really looking at, limited development, very much recreational, very much green space, open space oriented. Similarly with the AG and homestead, it's because they're more specific to trying to have that rural character. So that's why they're more so listed as special purpose based districts versus being a residential based district or a non-residential based district, because it would allow for a variety of use types, but it's more intended for this specific character and context area. Tommy, were you able to pull that up in terms of how we're actually defining that in the code directly?
I can. I was just going to also kind of meet to another reason or a big difference between the AG district and then what is currently rural, is that the AG district and even the homestead district is also going to be allowed to have additional uses that would require a commercial or industrial zoning now. So some of those things, so think of the fact that if you've got a working farm and you need a packaging facility or some other, use that is ancillary to that, is now permitted. So you wouldn't now have to go rezone, an acre or 2 acres to a commercial district or an industrial district. The differences between kind of those is that although they're rural, and of course rural allows agricultural uses, so the AG, there's HM, still allows for that at the appropriate scale. you can get an agricultural research facility in AG, but it might not be as appropriate in a smaller tract such as the HM district. And while we're doing that, I will pull up the definitions here.
Yeah, so in the code, we list that general purpose of special purpose based districts is the purpose and intent is to ensure that open areas within the county are preserved and to protect the rural and agricultural character of lands within the county in accordance with the comprehensive plan. So it's basically, again, just looking at those specific rural protections and rural character versus it being something else entirely, such as some of those residential districts or things like that. And then so chapter 4 question, the policy / principal use table does not specifically list paintballing. My recommendation is that paintballing is listed as a separate entity, not special exception. If changed, I also want to know which zoning district will allow these businesses to be allowed to operate under. So that's actually a specific use that we're taking a look at as part of this, because there has been instances where the way it's listed currently and how it's listed, it's not necessarily as appropriate. And so as part of the refinement and the bringing up to some of these standards, well, where does that use fit more appropriately in terms of being a separate use or even being another sub-use of a different type? And so I don't think we would be looking at it being a special exception, but probably being some type of special requirement, if anything. Tommy, did you want to say anything on that one as well?
Yeah, and I think the difference is that whether it's indoor or outdoor is going to be kind of what those requirements are, versus, and I think that looking at your districts, if you have an indoor facility and it's in a commercial district, I mean, I think that's, we see that now with some of the airsoft facilities, versus if you were to locate it in, say, a R1 or another district like that, those requirements are really different. But I think it's safe to say that commercial districts, you would see them there, or industrial districts. Now, where they end up, probably not in like the R1, R2, R3, R4, but potentially looking at where those requirements would be in some of the larger acre districts, that, how that would fit and look and feel.
And so next question, so chapter 4, it seems that the majority of uses that falling under AG seem to be listed as SE or SR. Why is AG so limited when RU old policy was such a large part of business development? So let me take a look at some of these. So, all right, so agritourism, rural retreat. So a lot of these are SR. And so I guess to that point, it's really just to ensure that continued compatibility. So where we do have things that are going to be required for special requirements, again, what are some of these requirements that need to be added to that use to ensure that compatibility with it? So how can we ensure that they function in context and in character, so that if it is a more commercial oriented or more industrial oriented use, that yeah, it's appropriate within the AG district, but it shouldn't be at the kind of full scale capacity, if you will, or full intensity of what that use might entail. And so where that use exists in, say, the industrial district, or so the LI or the general commercial district, GC, well, yeah, that's why they're permitted outright P without any restrictions, because based on that district, based on the other uses and that character type, those are more appropriate. But then where they're in the AG district, putting some limitations and restrictions on how some of those things look to ensure that compatibility overall with the district and the other uses that are within that district. Tommy, anything?
Most of them are, most of those requirements are like things like, if you have an equestrian center that you're located, you don't put that right up against an adjacent property owner, that you would be, set back from those property lines. Things like for like a farm winery, it gets into kind of what the intent is that it allows for on-site, consumption and sampling, but you can't necessarily have a full-blown food and beverage center with it. So it's just kind of little minor things like that are requirements that are put in there, or for like bed and breakfasts, or things of that nature that again, it doesn't turn into something that is a full-blown hotel rather than a bed and breakfast.
So the next one, so permitted use table, as the current table is constructed, hunt clubs are P under AG. I'm curious to know if hunt clubs have to meet the same requirements that shooting ranges must meet. Tommy, I'm gonna let you take
So as someone who's got some direct knowledge of a hunt club, there are state laws that govern that, SED&R, also law enforcement as well. So if you're not following the rules, shooting within, you're not in an elevated tree stand, 50 yards from a house, there are state rules and laws that cover that.
So I was trying to find that use specifically within our table. Recreation, entertainment. Yeah, okay. Shooting ranges are technically listed under recreation, so shooting regulations technically fall under the OS umbrella. So I think that was really falls back to kind of what is the intent of that district? What is that looking to achieve in terms of context and character? So open space really, kind of as the name implies, you're wanting to have limited development, limited structures, things of that nature. So, a shooting range would kind of entail some type of site development overall with what that would be looking to have. So even though it is a recreation use in terms of that category, it's not necessarily as appropriate as a open space in the open space district because of what all it would entail within it. Tommy, anything you want to add to that one? All right. Do you specifically know the effective range of a 5.56 NATO round? Let's see. I don't know if that's necessarily a relevant question to the zoning code, but I don't know. So, Tommy, I don't know.
No, I shoot a 270. I don't shoot the stuff I don't know what's behind it.
So because the old policy / new policy requires shooting ranges to have 200 yard setback requirement. Tommy, do you remember what the requirement currently?
I'm looking that up right now. My PDF doesn't want to cooperate.
D4, D7, D4, D7, D4, D7.
There we go. Shooting range outdoors. It says shooting range shall be at least 200 yards from adjacent property lines. Hours of operations are limited from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. Operator of the shooting range shall implement appropriate environmental management practices for containing and controlling and removing lead from the range in accordance with the latest edition of best management practices for lead at outdoor shooting ranges from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Also, adequate provision shall be made for the safety of surrounding property owners. Backstops at least 20 feet high shall be provided behind all target lines and supplemented by baffles designed and arranged to contain all projectiles within the boundaries of the range and to reduce noise exiting the site.
So it's similar language to what we have within the proposed code.
Yeah, I think it goes a little bit further as far as for the requirements for baffling and things of that nature.
Yeah.
I think in our current code, it's mainly just talking about some kind of berm or something else, basically set it behind the target area.
Okay. Yeah, so related to the paintball, so the reason I ask because hunt clubs are dependent on AG, so should paintball or other non-lethal activities. Yeah, so as mentioned, we're looking at paintball as being one of those additional uses that we look at under this. So again, whether it is a separate or a specific use type, or is it a use type or kind of a subtype under something that already exists? So does it fall under Trying to get back to the use table here. So does it fall under something like commercial recreation outdoor? Does it fall under commercial recreation indoor as kind of the separate use type? Or does it exist as a specific use type itself altogether? And so that's one of the things that we're taking a look at and we'll be making a recommendation on. And so question, when should we, the public, have an update on this matter? So what we're doing is basically, as we have the comments, we're adding these to kind of this consolidated comment document. And what we're going to be doing is presenting that to the Planning Commission and to County Council as some of these recommendations based on the comments that we've been getting, some things that we see as staff as to kind of what some of these additional changes that need to be made as part of this draft. And so that'll be one of those things as part of that adoption process that we have asked Council and Planning Commission to look at. So where some of those things need to occur. And so, things like paintball and some other uses that we have been brought to our attention, taking a look at those, how can we make some of those things exist or function better or more appropriately than how they are currently doing. So, and then Tommy, you were provided a PowerPoint that has some information related to this. So.
And I believe I did get an email from you. Unfortunately, because this thing started at 9:30, I didn't have a chance to look at it yet. But I will definitely, I wanted to forward that on to staff so they can check it out as well. So again, and we appreciate the information and then kind of, letting us know. Again, I think we've had conversations, in the past, that paintball, I think when this code came out, really just wasn't thought of. So it was just kind of lumped in or really forgotten in the old code. And then in this code, it was carried forward via the consultant as kind of under what it had been functioning as an interpretation. So I believe that and a few other uses that we've identified will either come out in some way, shape, or form and be more appropriately framed for the zoning districts. So I know, at least for me, from seeing some of those airsoft and the paintballs become a lot more popular than it was when I was growing up. So.
Yeah, we'll definitely take a look at that. So if there's not any other questions, we appreciate everyone's time today and thank you for joining us. And so just again, our information is listed here. So further questions, you can email Tommy or myself. Additional comments, you can email to us, or they can be made through the project website at the link below. So if you do want to make comments, again, you can submit them to us directly, or you can submit them to the project website. Either one works. You can also give us a call at 576-2190 to either schedule an appointment, ask us questions that you may have, what have you. So just, again, we thank you for your time and we thank you for your interest with the Land Development Code, and we hope to have you continue engaging with us as we continue through the process. And so we thank you all for your time today, and we appreciate you being here with us.
Thank y'all. Hope you have a good rest of your day.